And Leah conceived and bore a son. She called his name Reuben, for she said, because Yahweh has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, because Yahweh has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time I will praise Yahweh. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. And Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children. She envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children, or I shall die. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Then she said, here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her, so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, good fortune has come. So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you also take my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come into me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a 6th son. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may Yahweh add to me another son. This is the word of the living God. Well, this family came to our church today. How would we begin to help them? Sometimes you can't unscramble the egg, and that is a sad reality that some people's situations, you have to work with what you have. You can't undo what has happened, and so you begin right where they are. And that is an encouragement that God's grace comes to us wherever we find ourselves and begins to work in us and help us right there. And here's just a passage that shows the realism of human life. And this also shows us the reality of how the biblical authors don't airbrush the main characters of the storyline. We see all the messiness of the first family here. You call this the Real Housewives of Haran. And there's all kinds of biblical counseling issues that you could look at in this passage. I mean, anger, idolatry, envy. You have a passive husband. You have lack of gratitude and thankfulness. You have surrogacy, wombs for rent. You have people not even perceiving what God is doing, and in many ways, and so many other things. This is really a messy section. However, as if you remember last week, God's name wasn't really mentioned at all, and we saw the providence of God at work, and Jacob not even recognizing that. Here, though, in this chapter, God is mentioned a ton in this passage. God is giving the ability to conceive and blessing the family with children. And so it's not that God wasn't at work in the last section. Of course he was, but it was not the absence of God's working highlighted his providential working, I guess you could say. But the text, Moses wants to make it really clear that God is active. He's on the move in this chapter, despite the sinfulness of his chosen people. So what is the message of this section? You look at this and you're like, this is kind of like a genealogy, because it's like, here's this son, and here's his name, and here's this son, and here's his name, and here's this son, and here's his name, and here's his one daughter. And don't forget Dinah, they had a daughter too. But what do you do with this? What's the message for us? Well, I think you could say it simply like this: messy families and marvelous faithfulness. Messy families and marvelous faithfulness. That's what we see here. Now, just for 1 second, we're going to jump over to Ruth. This is, forward. This is ahead. And in Ruth chapter 4, when Boaz and Ruth are married, they're about to be married, and it's clear that Boaz will marry Ruth. The people give a blessing upon Ruth and Boaz. And in Ruth 4, verse 11, it says, "Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, 'We are witnesses. May Yahweh make the woman,'" that's Ruth, "'who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel.'" So we might say it like this, that they are saying, may God make you foundational in God's plans. May God give you a foundational role in the people of God, like Rachel and Leah. And so the author, looking back at a place like this and seeing how God used Rachel and Leah to bring about the 12 tribes, as well as their servants, the author of Ruth sees how foundational this was. It doesn't mention all their sin in that little statement, but the main focus of the author of Ruth is God used them to have a foundational role. And may that be the case for you, Ruth, and you, Boaz. And did that happen? Absolutely. That prayer was answered, because Ruth and Boaz have a massively foundational role in advancing God's plans in history. And of course, they have Obed and the grandfather of David. So God is at work. God is at work despite the messiness here. The faithfulness of God is really what is on display in this. Here's what one writer said about this chapter, summarizing it. Quote, "The covenant God remains faithful in and in spite of the slop and messes of the covenant people." It's kind of a good way to put it. Now, look how this story is bracketed. Okay, there's a bracketing so that we can see the kind of the seams of the text. If you look in the first verse 31, chapter 29, it says, "When Yahweh saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." And then look at verse 22 of chapter 30. "Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb." So on either end, you have statements of God opening the womb, God giving conception. One is for Leah, and the other is for Rachel, the foundational women in Israel, for the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes. And so that's the bracketing. And really throughout the naming of these children, there will be multiple references to God and God giving them children and God being the one who gives conception. And so that's a massive emphasis in the text. Really, it's hard to go away from this text and not see the fact that God is the one granting these children to Rachel and Leah, Jacob, and their servants. And so that is the focus of the text. Now, why would that be so critical for the message of Genesis, that God would emphasize his giving this family so many children? You promised Messiah? Tie it in more with, that's absolutely right. How do we make that connection now? Yeah, to seed and what covenant? Abrahamic covenant, yeah. So God has promised to, it's interesting, the author of Hebrews focuses on how, in chapter 6, how God fulfilled the promise singular to Abraham to give him a seed, and that's fulfilled in Isaac. So there's some like historical fulfillments of the Abrahamic covenant, but then he says, but there's a lot that needs to be fulfilled, and there's promises, plural, that still will be fulfilled. And so God has already given Abraham Isaac, but there's still more to be done. That was a very small amount. God said the stars of the sky. And so you had Abraham has Isaac, the seed of the promise. Of course, he has Ishmael as well. But you have Isaac has Jacob and Esau. But now you see Jacob has 11 kids. We're going to pick up Benjamin later. But you see has 10 boys and 1 girl. And so, 11 boys and 1 girl at this point. So God is emphasizing that he is making this happen. And you have to have the grid. This isn't just random. It's like, oh, here's this family having a bunch of kids. No, this is a special family. And this is God fulfilling his promise, because we're in the book of Genesis and it's moving the story along of God bringing about the seed promise. And so we're seeing God highlight how he is fulfilling that promise. So that's the big takeaway, is God is bringing about what he said in the Abrahamic covenant. In a small way, to be sure, but nevertheless, starting to give children. And yet, in a way that includes the messiness of humanity, the messiness of sin. So, yes. Yeah, please do.
God is faithful in spite of their sin, but I think it's also important to say God is faithful through their sin.
Yeah.
That's providence at work.
Yes.
Great plan, government.
Yeah, and that's picking up on a theme that's starting to really develop actually has already been developing, but is being added to in this story. And it's that theme that God brings good out of evil, or through evil even. Because, you don't have to go far in the biblical narrative to realize, chapter 3, here's the fall. And this doesn't catch God by surprise. This is part of his plan. And yet there is sin, and God is going to use this. We don't know the full, in Genesis 3, you don't know how it's all going to work out. But God is going to bring glory to himself through this plan. But then you see it here. God is moving. We've already seen it. Jacob and Esau's story. We're just seeing the sinful actions of his people. And yet somehow God's plan continues to advance through those actions. And then, of course, we see Joseph. And that's a massive emphasis there. And Joseph recognizes it. He tells his brothers, you sent me away to Egypt, but God sent me. And then he goes, it wasn't you who sent me, but God. And you're like, wait, what? And the answer is it's both. And then he says, what you meant for evil, God intended it for good. That very evil act, God intended that for good. So we're seeing that played out here. Richie just stole my conclusion. That was the conclusion to this message. So, all right, there we go. But we brought it forward. So it's okay. It's okay. Good observation. Now, just some more observational things about the text. There's a couple of ways to break this down. There's kind of 3 sections, and each sees the birth of 4 children. You have chapter 29, 31 to 35, so basically the back end of chapter 29. Then 30, 1 to 13, another 4. 14 to 24, another 4 children. So, and so here you're seeing, that's one way to look at it. Then another way is just to look at whose children are being born. You have Leah's sons, first round, in verses 31 to 35, chapter 29. Then Bilhah's sons for Rachel. So like put Rachel in parentheses because this is Rachel's servant, Bilhah, in verses 1 to 8 of chapter 30. Then Zilpah's sons, put Leah in parentheses there because that's hers. And I say parentheses because there's a phrase that's used that is kind of a technical phrase for like adoption, that these children would be their children, even though the servants are bearing them. You have, even surrogacy going on here. It's, So 9 to 13 is Zilpah. Then Leah's sons and her daughter in verses 14 to 21. And then finally, Rachel's son, Joseph, in verses 22 to 24. So that's some of the ways to break this down in different ways. I really have three main lessons that we'll kind of fly through here and spend more time on some than others. But we'll start in verses 31 to 35, the end of chapter 29, and look at the favor of God for the rejected. The favor of God for the rejected. And this is Leah. And Leah's life is tragic, right? Here is the hated wife. And, when you think of love and hate in the Old Testament especially, and even going into the New Testament, it's this idea of choice, right? Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. The idea being communicated is God chose Jacob and he rejected Esau. That's the idea between those two. And Jesus will pick up on that. Whoever doesn't hate his father and mother, right? He means if it comes down to a choice, then you choose me over your family, right? So that's the idea of love and hate. And so she's rejected. She was not the one Jacob wanted. He marries her, but he doesn't want her. He ends up marrying Rachel a week later after the wedding to Leah. And so already so much conflict through that. And then they start having children, or Leah starts having children. And notice the idea why. She is having children, verse 31, because when Yahweh saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb. And so we see here, God knew all about this situation. He took notice of Leah and acted on her behalf. God loves the unloved. And what an encouraging picture for us. In a couple places to cross-reference here. Psalm 27, verse 10. It says, "For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but Yahweh will take me in." Here's the psalmist finding refuge in Yahweh despite the closest family relationships rejecting the psalmist. Of course, Luke 18, verse 7. It says, "And will not God give justice to his elect who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them?" You see this principle in Scripture, and God takes notice of Leah. She's the unloved. She's the hated wife. And notice as well, God is aware of the sorrows of his people. He's dialed into what is happening. As the psalmist at one point says, "You keep my tears in a bottle," just to show the care of God, that he knows every one of our concerns. He keeps track of them. And so he shows favor to her. And she has the first children. God grants her conception. And so she has 4 children here. Reuben, firstborn. And their names here are all fascinating. The idea of Reuben is related to the word for look or see. It's like see, a son, or look, a son, as the firstborn. So that's a good name, I guess, for a firstborn. Look, and this is like the Israel's baby book, baby name book, for coming generations. So the Lord sees affliction, and here's a son. Now, what's interesting about the names, just as a footnote, the name itself has some kind of idea built into it, like look, a son, or has like related to the word look. but the wives will, the mothers will often add something to that and say some interpretive lens on top of that. And so the Lord sees like my affliction. So the son's name is, look, a son, and she's seeing how God has seen her affliction. Now, another thing to note is both Leah and Rachel will make comments, like theological interpretations of their circumstances based on their children, that I think we ought to be a little cautious of endorsing those because they're just saying what they think. The text is not necessarily saying this was what was happening. This is what God was doing, because they're a mess in this whole story. And so they're making observations. Oh yeah, God is blessing me, kind of type thing. And you're like, this is how they're perceiving things. This is their theology. Whether it's right or not has to be judged elsewhere. So Reuben is the firstborn, then Simeon. It has a connection to the idea of hearing. So to hear, the Lord hears. So probably the prayers of Leah. And then Levi, it has the idea of to join or to be joined. It expresses her hope for attachment. And then Judah's born, and it has the idea of praise for the Lord. And that's actually going to be picked up how the brothers of Judah in Genesis 49, when Jacob blesses them, it says that the brothers will praise Judah. They'll Judah. Notice how the naming of Leah's children expresses the desire of her heart. What is that? What do you notice about how she's naming her children and what it reveals about what she really wants? The love of her husband, yeah. Now my husband will love me. Hope for attachment, Levi. She really desires this. And it's the one thing she cannot get, sadly. And people try all sorts of things to get someone to love them, sometimes sinful things. And Leah is no different, as we'll see later in the text. In Deuteronomy, this probably would lead to this law, be a historical basis for it later in Israel's history. In Deuteronomy 21, verse 15, it says, if a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him children, stop there. It's like, wow, it's like Moses read Moses. It's like, of course, he's the same author. I mean, this is just exactly our situation. And if the firstborn son belongs to the unloved, is that our situation? Yes, Reuben. Then on the day when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, he may not treat the son of the unloved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the unloved, who is the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has. For he is the firstfruits of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. And so, I mean, the law of God even has stipulations for just finding us where we are in our messed up situation and helping us to think through how to go from there. If you find yourself in this situation, hypothetically, this is a crazy situation, and here's what you ought to do and not do. So God shows favor to Leah by granting her conception. Now, notice a few things. What does Leah have over Rachel in that's seen really by God's favor in this passage? What does she have different than Rachel has? So think of a few things. She's the first one to have children. Yeah. What else though about these children? Okay. Yeah, that too. But like over comparing and the competition between Rachel and Leah, so to speak. So she has the first sons. She has more. Actually, she has the most. She has more than Bilhah, than Zilpah, than Rachel. Rachel's only have two herself, but Leah has the most by herself. One other thing is, look at the actual four sons here that are born. What do you notice that stands out about these four? Yeah. Yep. So Levi, the future priests, and Judah, the future kings of Israel. Now, whether she is fully aware of that yet, probably not. But nevertheless, what a blessing. What a blessing God has given this unloved woman. And that's just something great to remember. God is doing far more than we ever realize in our situation. And one of the things that's really sad about this story is this whole family is so consumed with the idols of their heart that they become blind to what God is doing, nevertheless, how he is blessing them with children. And of course, she doesn't probably know of what her children are going to do in the future, but God does. And he is going to bring about not only a great nation, but through these two sons, the priestly and kingly lines. And so we just trust, we have to trust that God is faithful, even when we cannot see how he is working out completely. But it wasn't hard to see that God was blessing them greatly with children. So God knows all about your situation. He knows what is best for you. He is accomplishing his plans in your life despite how others treat you. So this is the favor of God for the rejected. Notice secondly, this is kind of the bulk of the story. I call this the factory of idolatry in the heart. That's a borrow from John Calvin. The factory of idolatry in the heart, verses 1 to 21. And just look at verse 1. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." Now, Rachel expresses the desire of her heart through her words, right? So this is helpful, just as you think about how we work, how God has designed us. Jesus says on 2 occasions, the mouth speaks out of the overflow of the heart, or out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. So what does that mean?
Whatever's in your heart comes out the mouth.
That's right. Yeah. So have you heard people say, "I didn't mean to say that"? How do you think about that now? I didn't want to have the fallout of what I said, but that's what was in my heart. Otherwise, it wouldn't have come out, right? Like you spill a liquid. If you had water in the cup, that's what came out. If you had Coke, that's what came out. If you had coffee, that's what comes out. What is in there eventually comes out. And it's usually pressurized circumstances that cause something to come out. And so, is this a pressurized circumstance? Yes. It is squeezing her, and she is expressing the desire of her heart. The Proverbs say, the heart of a man is like deep waters, but a man of understanding draws it out. Now, this is challenging because when we want to help other people, we have to be really good listeners, and we have to ask lots of good questions because we have to see the circumstances going on. We have to hear what they're saying and pay careful attention. What did they not say? What did they say? Because that's going to be a good barometer of their heart. Or think of Proverbs 4:23. Guard your heart, for from it flow the springs of life, the issues of life. And so the heart is mission control center. It is where we value things. It's where we think. It's where we choose. It's where we treasure. All those things, biblically speaking, the heart is. The heart is the mind in biblical thinking. They're all intertwined together. It's like a catch-all category. So, if you could sit down with Rachel, some of you ladies, she comes to our church, and they're struggling, their family, and you get coffee with her, and you start just loving her and asking her questions. Rachel, what do you want? What do you really want? That'd be a good question for Rachel. What would she say? What would she say? I want children, right? Yeah. Well, she has the love of her husband, right? Rachel does that, yeah. So here's the interesting thing. We're jumping ahead, but you said it. So each of them wants what the other has. And they believe that if they can get that, they will be satisfied. But what is the flawed logic of that? Yes, but think about if both of them want what the other has, and that will make them happy, what? Yeah, right? So if I have what you want, and you have what I want, and we're both not happy, what makes us think that
I'll be happy when I get it.
getting the thing that I don't have will make me happy? Because you have it and you're not happy. And so it reveals the foolishness of idolatry, really. It's the belief that if I could just get that, then I would be happy. Then I would have enough. And so you sit down with her, and I think if you were to say to her, to Rachel, what do you want? She says, I want children. If you were to stop there, I think you would do her a disservice. And here's why. Because sometimes if you were to say, yeah, that's your idol, children is your idol. Now, yeah, that's kind of true. But I think you would want to go a step further and say this, Rachel, why do you want children so much? Right? It's always like, if you just go a little bit further, because children, probably for Rachel, represent something that she really wants. And the text doesn't give us a definitive answer to that. Maybe she would say, so we're just speculating right now, but maybe she would say the recognition that would come. That seems to be what's happening in the text, because her sister wife is having children, and that is bothering her greatly. And so Leah's getting all the recognition in this culture, and Rachel is not. And so possibly that's what it is. And so you'd have to ask some more questions. What would getting children do for you? What is it that you want so much? And so you're after that. And you're not after it for yourself. You're after it to help her see that, right? Because then once you've identified rightly, this is what I'm clinging to, this is the idol, then you can really help someone. Because when you get at the root, at the core, you can then apply scripture to that issue. Why do you want a reputation so much? There's so much you could do from there and redirect their thoughts to God and how they ought to be thinking and focusing on. But until you get there, it may be more of a superficial fix. And so she needs to have her heart redirected. But, okay, we can't spend all our time on Rachel. So guys, you get together and you go fishing with Jacob, right? Look at verse 2. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? I love what Dale Ralph Davis says here about Jacob. He gets angry, that's obvious. He says, Jacob scores high on theology, but low on sensitivity. You're sitting down with them, and you're like, hey, so, our wives talked, and what happened? You guys had a blow up at home, and you're there. He's like, well, I told her the truth. I told her what she needed to hear. And you're like, well, what did you say? Well, am I in the place of God? And really he's saying it's your fault. It's your fault, Rachel, because I'm having children with Leah. Nothing's wrong there. You're the problem, Rachel. That's what he's saying to her. Now, contrast this with Abraham and Isaac. What did they do when their wives were barren? They prayed, yeah. In fact, Isaac prayed in front of his wife that God would grant conception. So Jacob is very different in this regard. And so you sit down and you say, what are you so angry about? Jacob, what is your anger revealing about what your heart wants? It reveals basically, there's more specifics for Jacob, but it reveals a heart whose perceived rights have been attacked. And so Jacob's heart reveals anger. What are you angry about, Jacob? What do you want? And then look at verse 3. Notice how Rachel seeks a sinful practice of her culture and what she has seen her family do before to get what she wants. She has this is like the Hagar method, but this is the Bilhah method in verses 3-8. And we'll just kind of summarize this. She sends in Bilhah, and Bilhah has a bunch of children for Rachel. Dan, God has vindicated me. Naphtali, my wrestling or struggle. And then Leah gets back. She's like, okay, we too can play at that game. I've got a servant too, Zilpah. And so she gives him, and she gets Gad, which means like fortune or lucky, and Asher, which means happy. So lucky and happy are born. But notice, just forever memorialized in these names are the conflict of this family. Because it's like, God vindicated me. That's my son, Dan, And then my struggle, Naphtali. And then Leah's like, oh yeah? Well, I got lucky. And I got happy here. People are going to call me happy. So they're just going back and forth with these names. And then you have the mandrake madness. What is going on here? Verses 14-21. Reuben's out playing in the woods, and he comes back and he's like, Mom, look what I found. And he's got these mandrakes. He's like, give me those. Leah wants those. What are the mandrakes? Well, it's kind of like a love fruit. In Hebrew, lover is dod, love is dodim, and a mandrake is called dudaim. So they're related in this idea of a word for love. Now, really, the simple explanation is this is like an old wives' tale. This is not something the Bible's endorsing, but it is a cultural thing that they thought, oh, this is like maybe an aphrodisiac or something to help her to conceive. And so they believe that this is going to have some ability to overcome the ability to their barrenness. So Leah has them, and she can have kids, but Rachel can't. And so Leah wants the love of Jacob, and Rachel wants kids. So they come up with this plan. And somehow it seems in the text that Rachel, because most logically she has the love of her husband, she controls the rights to Jacob, really, and who can spend the night with Jacob. And so she says, okay, here's a deal. You give me the mandrakes, and you can sleep with Jacob for the night. And so, okay, so she gives them, and she goes in, and she has a child. In fact, she has 3 more, which is probably over a course of some time. And she has these 3, Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. Issachar is God has given me my hire, or got for hire. So I hired my husband to get a child. That's how messed up this is. Zebulun, it has the idea of a dowry, and then Dinah is Leah's daughter. She doesn't have an explanation for her name. But now, no, just make an observation here. Do the mandrakes work? No. How do you know they don't work? From the text. Yeah, because Rachel, right? So Leah gives them away to be with Jacob, and she gets pregnant, and Rachel gets them and doesn't get pregnant. So it's like, these clearly don't work. And so it's the text emphasizing yet again, it's God who gives conception. The promise of the Abrahamic covenant does not come about through these shady methods, these old wives' tales. It comes about by God granting conception. So we see God at work here. And I said already that Calvin called the heart a perpetual factory of idols. Leah's idol is the love of her husband. Rachel's idol is whatever children will give to her. And I guess we could say as well for Leah, whatever the love of her husband would give her as well. Now, love from a spouse is good. Children are a good thing. But even good desires can get out of whack. They can be elevated to an inordinate desire. The degree for that desire can be too high. And Stuart Scott has offered a helpful definition of how do you know when something is an idol in your heart? And he gives two explanations. He says, something is an idol in my heart if I am willing to sin in order to get it, or I'm willing to sin if I don't get it. I'm willing to sin in order to get this thing, and it doesn't always have to be something tangible like you can hold. It may be a reputational thing or, a pleasure or whatever. I'm willing to sin in order to get it, or sin because I did not get it. So let's just say you love comfort. You idolize comfort, and, something happened, Saturday comes along, and you're like, oh, I'm just planning to have some me time, and you're going to do your thing. And then, whatever it is, someone comes in and they don't know about this desire of yours, and they come in and they mess up the day. They add things, they give you things to do, whatever. And it messes your day up, and you go, I'm angry at them. Now, you sinned because you're angry, but why did you sin? Well, something was elevated in your desire to the point where you sinned because you didn't get something. Now, flip the other way, and if you might sin to get something in particular. So that's just a helpful working definition of idolatry. And that's what we see here in the family all over the place. We could spend more time with the family and helping them, but I think it's just a little interesting case study of how the idols of their hearts are driving them and leading them to these actions. It's seen in their speech, what they're revealing, but also in their actions and how they're acting. Their idols are directing them. They believe that they can't be happy or please God unless they get what they want. And yet that's very misguided. They're seeking out what Jeremiah calls broken cisterns that can hold no water, forsaking the living water, which is God. This last point is short. It's just the fact that the faithfulness of God for the undeserving, verses 22 to 24. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. She called his name Joseph, saying, may Yahweh add to me another son. Now, look at this first phrase, verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel. Does that sound like anything? Is that distinctive in any way? So here's just a little, as you're thinking about it, one thing that's really helpful to do in the Bible study to see like connections, to know whether an author wanted you to make a connection is what we might call linguistic distinctiveness. In other words, something that is a phrase usually that is unique. It's not used a lot. It can't be the word the, because that's used all the time. It can't be the word God, but it could be maybe like the living God. That's more particular. Or God of hosts, because that's more unique. And so you're looking for those kind of things that don't come up a lot, and they're connected to some other reality that the author wants you to make a connection to. So I've already hinted that this is something linguistically distinct. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said that. Where do we see this? It can't be that far. It's in Genesis. It's before Genesis 30.
Sarah.
No.
In chapter 8, I've cheated.
Yeah, you cheated. Yeah, but that's good. That's good to cheat because you can look at your cross references. They usually have these. And it's in what context? The Noah and the Noahic covenant. God remembered Noah. So here's another covenantal context. We've already pointed out that God is bringing to pass his faithful promise to bring about children for the Abrahamic covenant. And back in Genesis 8:1, you have God being faithful to the covenant with Noah. So in both contexts, you have a unique phrase that's meant to link us back to that other one. And in both of them, there's a covenantal context and God's faithfulness to an individual based upon his covenant. And so God is going to act in light of what he has promised. And so that is really the takeaway that Moses wants you to have. God is remembering his covenant promises to make a nation, to give seed to this promised line. And he's doing that despite all of the sin. And he's doing it for Rachel. So the story begins with God giving conception to Leah, and it ends with him giving it to Rachel. And in all that, he is fulfilling his covenant promises. All right, Richie already took my conclusion, so I think we're done. Let me pray. Father, thank you for our study, and we pray that it would enrich our hearts, help us to identify and idols of our hearts, things that we treasure too much, and realign our hearts back to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
I didn't know how to read.